He was just an older gentleman, quietly settling into his premium seat, his heart buzzing with anticipation. After so many years apart, he was finally on his way to see his grandson. It wasn't just any visit. It had been over a decade since they'd last embraced. And now, thanks to a surprise first-class ticket his grandson had gifted him, he was about to be reunited. But the reunion would have to wait. Before the aircraft even left the gate at Northbridge International, a uniformed woman briskly strode down the aisle. Her pace was sharp, her eyes scanning each seat like a hawk. When she reached his row, she stopped abruptly. Her voice was firm and unnervingly loud. "Sir, you'll need to move. This seat isn't assigned to you." The other passengers paused their conversations, looked up from their screens, and turned toward the scene. A murmur of curiosity rippled through the cabin. She didn't know yet, but the man she was confronting had far more influence than she could imagine. And within minutes, everything she thought she controlled would unravel. He sat with a gentle posture, adjusting the rim of his glasses while flipping through a frayed paperback novel. His hands, weathered and steady from years of life's work, trembled just slightly as he turned the page. The joy within him was hard to contain. After saving, planning, and waiting, his grandson had done something no one in the family had expected. Bought him a premium class ticket to visit Oak Ridge. He wore his Sunday best. A navy jacket, creased slacks, polished black shoes, and that unmistakable glint in his eye that only love could bring. His face bore a kind warmth. The soft drone of the plane's ventilation hummed overhead, and passengers shuffled into their seats. Some were chatting, others locked into screens or nodding off with travel pillows. A flight attendant came striding down the aisle, checking seatbelts and tossing professional smiles toward travelers. Her uniform was immaculate, her back straight, her walk confident. She had the air of someone who didn't like being questioned. But her demeanor changed the moment she spotted him. Her steps slowed. Her expression, once neutral, faltered, subtly but unmistakably. She glanced from his face to the book in his lap, then down to the seat number above him. Her brow tightened. She moved in close. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism that made the air around them grow colder. He looked up, caught off guard, but not shaken. "Of course," he replied, offering a polite nod. He carefully reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out the ticket his grandson had lovingly printed for him. It was folded neatly, protected like something sacred. He handed it over with a soft smile. He expected her to glance at it, nod, and move on, but she didn't. She turned it over slowly, scrutinizing every inch of it like she was trying to catch a forgery. Her lips pursed. "This is a first-class boarding pass," she said, raising a brow as if it couldn't possibly be right. "Yes," he replied, still measured. "My grandson surprised me with it. It's my first time up here." She exhaled sharply through her nose, a short breath filled with judgment. Her fingers tapped against the paper. "You're traveling alone?" "I am," he answered, his voice a bit quieter now. Passengers nearby started paying attention. A few turned their heads, some out of interest, others out of discomfort. They could sense something wasn't right. She handed the ticket back, but didn't step away. "I need to double-check something. Please stay here." Without waiting for acknowledgement, she pivoted and marched toward the front of the cabin, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the classes. He exhaled, adjusting the collar of his jacket. His hands returned to his lap, folded together as he sat upright. There was no need to make a scene. Still, he could feel eyes drifting toward him, some subtle, others not. He had known moments like this before. Not on planes, but in banks, in restaurants, in hotel lobbies. It was always the same look. The silent assumption, "You don't belong here." Moments later, she returned. "Sir," she said stiffly, "I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. There appears to be an issue with your ticket." His heart skipped. An issue? Yes, she repeated, her voice now cold. This area is reserved for first-class passengers. It seems you've been placed in the wrong section. He sat in stunned silence for a beat. His hands gripped the armrests gently, his shoulders stiff. There's no mistake. This is my assigned seat. Her arms crossed, her tone hardening. Sir, I don't want this to become a problem. Please take your belongings and relocate to the back. It wasn't a request. It was a decision already made. He didn't argue. He didn't yell or protest. Instead, he reached beneath his seat for his small duffel bag and stood slowly. Passengers were watching now. Some pretending not to, others leaning in. The silence had thickened. Before leaving the row, he reached into his jacket and retrieved his phone. With careful fingers, he typed a brief message. His face showed no emotion. Then he tucked the phone away and turned toward the aisle. What the flight attendant didn't know was that the message he just sent had started a chain reaction she couldn't stop. And it had only taken a single text. Walter Green walked slowly down the narrow aisle of the aircraft, the soft thuds of his footsteps almost swallowed by the low hum of the engines. Yet every step felt loud in his own mind, each one heavier than the last. He didn't rush, not because he was tired, but because of the weight in his chest. Not fear, not even embarrassment, but a deeper ache. That quiet sting that comes when the world reminds you you're still not seen for who you are. He clutched his bag tightly. It wasn't heavy. His grip wasn't from strain. It was to stop the subtle trembling in his fingers. He had lived long enough to recognize this feeling. The sideways stares. The hushed tones. The disbelief in someone's eyes that a man like him could ever belong in a place like that. But this time, something had been taken from him. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about dignity. About a moment he had waited years for. He reached the back of the plane and slowly eased himself into one of the smaller, narrow seats in economy. The legroom was scarce, the cushion worn. But he made no complaint. He simply rested his hands on his knees, took a slow breath, and looked straight ahead. His mind was replaying it all. The looks, the tone, the assumption that he didn't deserve to be where he was. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. One unread message lit up the screen. What do you mean they made you move? He took another breath and typed back. They said there was a mix-up. Asked me to switch to economy. The response came seconds later. Who told you that? His fingers hovered for a moment. Then he typed, the flight attendant. He could have left it at that. But something inside urged him to keep going. She didn't even check the system. Just looked at me and assumed. There was a pause, longer than before. What's the flight number? Walter looked down at the boarding pass, typed it in, and hit send. He didn't know exactly what was coming next, but for the first time since stepping onto that plane, a small voice inside him whispered, "This isn't over." At the front of the aircraft, Marissa Blake had returned to her usual rhythm. She handed out drinks, checked seatbelts, and flashed routine smiles. On the surface, she appeared unfazed, but something in the first-class cabin felt off. The air had shifted. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange now glanced around quietly, their expressions tight, their postures uncomfortable. One woman in a tan shawl leaned toward her husband and whispered, "That didn't feel right." He gave a short nod, keeping his eyes fixed on the window. The plane began taxiing down the runway, and the soft tone overhead reminded passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Marissa gave a final sweep down the aisle before retreating into the front galley. She poured herself a small cup of coffee and let out a content sigh. To her, it was just another day on the job. Another flight. Another minor situation handled. She didn't think much of the man she had sent to the back. As far as she was concerned, she had followed protocol. The seat hadn't matched what she expected, and she had corrected it. That was her job. Nothing more. But what she didn't realize was that the small text message Walter had sent minutes earlier had already started a ripple, and it was heading straight for her. A sudden crackle interrupted the quiet murmur of the cabin. The captain's voice, steady and unmistakable, filled the plane. "Miss Blake, please report to the cockpit immediately." The coffee cup froze in Marissa's hand. A few passengers turned their heads, brows lifting in curiosity. It wasn't a typical announcement, especially before takeoff. She composed herself quickly, smoothing the front of her uniform, brushing down her skirt. With precise steps, she made her way through the aisle. Her eyes stayed forward, ignoring the glances she could feel pressing into her from either side. She reached the cockpit and tapped lightly before stepping inside. The captain, a seasoned man with salt and pepper hair and sharp blue eyes, turned slightly in his seat. His expression was unreadable. The co-pilot gave her a short glance, then looked away. Before Marissa could speak, a sharp voice rang out from the intercom on the panel. "Is she there?" The voice was crisp, male, professional, but there was something else beneath it. A tension, a weight that made her spine straighten involuntarily. The captain reached over and pressed a button. "Yes, she's here." The next voice came with no preamble. "This is Elliot Wren, Flight Operations." Marissa felt the name hit like a cold wind. He was a high-ranking operations director, rarely involved in real-time flight communication. "We've received a direct complaint from corporate about the removal of a premium passenger," he said, voice clipped and serious. "We need an explanation. Now." She cleared her throat, her composure thinning. "Yes, sir. There was a gentleman seated in first class. After reviewing his ticket, I believed it was a seating error and moved him to economy to prevent issues." There was a beat of silence. Then Elliot's tone dropped. Colder now. "Did you verify the ticket through the onboard system?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. I looked at it. "Yes," she said, stumbling slightly. "But I didn't confirm it digitally." Another pause. "Did you speak with the gate staff before removing him?" Marissa's throat went dry. "No, sir." The captain turned toward her now, his jaw clenched. "Do you even know who that man is?" Elliot asked. She blinked, caught off guard. "No, sir." The captain answered for her, his voice grim. "His name is Walter Green. He's a long-time premium client, and his grandson, Jordan Green, is one of the airline's corporate stakeholders." Marissa's face drained of color. "You didn't just displace a passenger," Elliot continued. "You publicly disrespected someone with more influence over this airline than most of us on board." Marissa stood frozen, the truth settling like lead in her chest. "You will escort Mr. Green back to first class and offer a full apology. In front of every passenger." The captain's next words hit harder than any turbulence. "After landing, you'll report directly to the executive office. Your employment status is under immediate review." A final click ended the call. The silence in the cockpit roared in her ears. The captain didn't yell. He didn't scold. He just looked at her with disappointment. "Fix it," he said flatly. Her legs felt like sandbags as she turned and left the cockpit. Her hands shook slightly at her sides. The uniform that once gave her authority now felt like it was made of iron. As she walked past first class, she could already feel the eyes, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she belonged here. Inside the cockpit, the hum of the engines filled the silence between the captain and the flight operations manager's voice on the line. The captain gave a slow nod, then pressed the button beside him again. "Yes, she's here," he confirmed. The next words from the speaker sliced through the air like a cold wind. "Miss Blake, we just received a direct call from corporate. There's been a formal complaint involving the removal of a premium passenger from first class. We need an immediate explanation." Marissa Blake's heart thudded hard against her ribs. She straightened slightly, struggling to hold her posture as if it could somehow stabilize the sinking weight inside her chest. She cleared her throat. "Yes, sir. There was a gentleman seated in first class. After reviewing his boarding pass, I believed he'd been placed there in error. To maintain proper seating procedures, I directed him to economy. Silence followed, and in that pause, she felt the full weight of what was coming next. Then the voice returned. Firmer, sharper. Did you verify his ticket through the system before moving him? Her mouth opened. She hesitated. She had looked at the paper. She had seen the words, first class, but something inside her had simply assumed it was wrong. She had trusted her instinct instead of the protocol. I looked at the ticket, she said slowly, but I didn't verify it in the system. Did you check with the gate crew to confirm seating? Marissa's throat tightened. She forced herself to speak, even as her voice faltered. No, sir. The captain turned in his seat now, facing her completely. His jaw was tight, and there was no sympathy in his eyes. Do you even know who that man is? She blinked. No, sir. The captain responded before the operations manager could. That man is Walter Green. He's a respected frequent flyer, a decades-long customer of ours. And his grandson, Jordan Green, isn't just any traveler. He's a senior investor, a corporate partner, one of the people who keeps this airline in the sky. Marissa's breath caught. The cabin suddenly felt 10 degrees warmer. Or maybe it was just her skin, now flushed with realization. The operations manager's voice returned, slicing through the air once more. You didn't just displace a passenger, Miss Blake. You humiliated someone with more influence than most people working on this flight. You acted on an assumption. And now, corporate wants answers. She couldn't speak. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. The captain's voice followed, cool and direct. We've been given instructions. You will personally escort Mr. Green back to first class. You will apologize, and you will do it in front of every passenger. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot. But the manager wasn't finished. When this flight lands, you'll report immediately to the executive office. Your employment status is under review. A single click ended the call. The cockpit went silent, save for the humming of controls and the quiet buzz of systems at work. Marissa stood still, her breath shallow. She had never been spoken to like that. Not in training, not on the job, not ever. She had enforced policy 100 times before. She'd sent passengers back to economy for being in the wrong seat. But this time, she hadn't followed the proper steps. She hadn't verified. She hadn't asked. She had just decided. And now, that decision was about to cost her everything. The captain glanced back at his instruments. Then, without looking up, he said, "Fix your mistake." She walked out of the cockpit with lead in her limbs. The moment she passed the curtain and stepped into the cabin, her world shifted. The plane felt different. It wasn't louder, but somehow more alert, as if the walls themselves were aware of what was about to unfold. The cabin lights glowed softly above, casting golden light on the faces of passengers. Most weren't speaking. Some looked out the windows. Others scrolled quietly on their devices, but she could feel them, their eyes, shifting toward her. Every step down the aisle felt heavier than the last. Her shoes, once polished with pride, now felt like anchors pulling her to the floor. Her navy blue uniform, once a symbol of control and poise, now clung to her like a burden. Her name tag caught the light, M. Blake, and she wondered how many passengers would remember it later when they told this story to someone else. She reached the back of the plane. There he was. Walter Green sat by the window, just as he had since she forced him to leave his rightful seat. He hadn't touched his bag. He hadn't looked around. He just sat, his hands folded gently in his lap, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside. The seat he now occupied was tight and stiff, worlds away from the spacious comfort of the front row. It seemed even smaller in contrast to the calm dignity with which he carried himself. Marissa paused, inhaled, then crouched slightly beside him, trying to match his eye level. Her throat felt tight. Her voice, usually crisp and clear, came out softer this time. "Sir," she said, forcing the words past her lips. "There's been a misunderstanding." He didn't respond right away. His body didn't move. His breathing was even. His eyes remained on the window. And yet something in the air shifted. The silence between them stretched long enough for others to notice. Passengers leaned subtly into the aisle. Not overtly, just enough to hear. Finally, Walter turned to face her. His eyes were calm, but there was something in them that made her heart pound harder. Not anger, not hostility, but a quiet power. A stillness that was impossible to look away from. He didn't need to raise his voice. That silence said everything. She cleared her throat again, this time unable to meet his eyes fully. "I'd like to escort you back to your seat in first class," she said. Her tone lacked its earlier confidence. Now it sounded like something borrowed, empty of the authority it once held. Walter studied her face. Slowly. Thoroughly. Passengers who had ignored what happened earlier now listened intently, their postures shifting. He finally spoke. "A misunderstanding?" he asked, his voice even, deliberate. She nodded. "Yes. An error in seating." He tilted his head, not as an agreement, but as a challenge. "An error," he repeated, "or a choice?" A ripple passed through the nearby seats. A few people exchanged glances. They had heard the earlier confrontation. They had seen her posture then. Decisive, unquestioning. She gripped the headrest in front of her to steady herself. "I misjudged you." The words tasted unfamiliar, bitter. Walter didn't speak again. Instead, he reached for his bag, calmly, slowly, and stood with quiet grace, not in a rush, not allowing her to lead. He had taken back control of the moment. As he moved past her, he met her gaze one last time and said, "If you're going to apologize, Miss Blake, be honest about why you're doing it." The quiet gasps that followed weren't dramatic, but they were real. People felt it. Those who had pretended not to notice before were now watching, closely. He didn't wait for her reply. He walked forward, measured, composed. And behind him, Marissa followed, no longer in command, but trailing the man she had tried to belittle, the man who now held the attention and the respect of the entire cabin. Walter Green had heard apologies before. Some were hollow, some were rehearsed, and some were far too late, but none had ever come like this, delivered quietly in the middle of a plane with the weight of every watching eye hanging in the air. Marissa Blake, standing just inches from him, finally spoke the words. "I'd like to escort you back to your original seat, in first class." Walter slowly turned to face her. For the first time since she had confronted him, he looked her directly in the eye. His face was unreadable, his eyes steady, but there was no warmth in them now. There didn't need to be. The silence that followed between them didn't just speak. It shouted. All around them, passengers leaned ever so slightly forward, their curiosity no longer hidden. Some tilted their heads, pretending to read, but every ear was tuned in. The same people who had once ignored the earlier tension now couldn't look away. Walter studied her, not with anger, but with quiet calculation. And then, calmly, he asked, "So, you're saying this was a misunderstanding?" Marissa's lips parted, but her voice caught. She nodded, hesitating. Yes, it was. A mix-up in seating. Walter tilted his head ever so slightly. His gaze didn't soften. "A mix-up," he echoed. "Or a decision?" The atmosphere shifted. Subtle gasps rippled through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others stared ahead, pretending to be asleep, but their ears remained alert. Marissa gripped the back of the seat in front of her, grounding herself. I misjudged you," she said at last. The words felt unnatural on her tongue. She rarely had to admit fault, not like this. Walter let the sentence sit in the air between them, untouched. He gave no immediate reply. He just allowed the weight of her words to settle. On her, and on everyone who had watched it all unfold. Then, without rushing, he reached for his bag. He stood slowly, with dignity, every movement deliberate. He didn't look at her for direction. He didn't follow her lead. He wasn't going back to reclaim a seat. He was going back to reclaim his space, his respect, his rightful place. And he wasn't going to let her dictate how it happened. As he walked down the aisle, past the stunned stares and quietly regretful expressions, he paused only once, to look her in the eye and say, "If you're going to apologize, Miss Blake, be honest about why you did it." The impact of those words cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. In a few rows, someone let out a quiet breath. Another shifted in their seat, visibly uncomfortable. The truth of it was too loud to ignore. Because they had all seen it. They had watched him be singled out, and now they were watching her be held accountable. Marissa didn't say a word. She couldn't. Her throat was dry. Her face burned. She trailed behind him, her steps smaller now, her presence diminished. She was no longer leading, only following the man she had once dismissed. With every step, a piece of her pride fell behind her like crumbs. And with every glance she caught, each quiet stare from a passenger, she felt it. Not just judgment, but disappointment. Back in the first-class cabin, a stillness had settled in like fog. Walter walked down the aisle as if he belonged there, because he did. And everyone knew it now. He reached his seat, the one that had been his all along, and paused. Not for dramatic effect, not to reclaim anything loudly, just to breathe. He sat slowly, the leather creaking under him. He placed his bag beside his seat, adjusted the collar of his blazer, and leaned back slightly. Not in comfort, but in quiet power. Marissa stood beside him. Her hands were now folded in front of her, her usual stance of control replaced by hesitation. She felt exposed, stripped of her title, her posture, her command. She opened her mouth, trying to find a way to salvage what was left of her role. "If there's anything you need," she said, her tone forced back into professionalism, "please let me know." Walter didn't respond. He reached for his seatbelt and clicked it into place. Only then did he glance at her again, calm and direct. "You didn't ask me that when I first sat down." The words were soft, but the blow they carried echoed down the cabin like a bell tolling. A few rows ahead, a man coughed awkwardly. A woman wrapped her sweater a little tighter around her shoulders. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Because it wasn't a moment for noise. It was a moment for realization. Marissa's fingers twitched. She tried to speak. But no meaningful words came. Walter gave a small final nod, as if to say, "That's all." Then he turned away from her, opening the in-flight magazine without another word. Conversation over. Correction complete. And now he didn't owe her anything, not even a second glance. Marissa remained rooted in place. It was strange. She had spent years walking the aisles with ease, issuing instructions, answering questions, commanding respect. Now she didn't know how to take the next step. She felt the pressure of the passenger's silence, like a weight sitting on her chest. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and vanish before anyone had the chance to whisper about her mistake again. But it was too late. Everyone had already seen it. And worse, they had seen her, the version of herself she never meant to show. With nothing more to say and nowhere to hide, Marissa Blake turned from Walter Green's seat and began walking back toward the front galley. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, like they were moving out of habit, not strength. Her spine was rigid, her head down, but she could feel the weight of eyes trailing her. Then, before she'd even passed the third row, a voice over the intercom stopped her cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Her breath caught in her throat. The soft crackle of the PA system filled the cabin. Everyone looked up. Heads turned. A hushed silence spread like mist. We'd like to extend our sincerest apologies for the earlier disruption. Our first-class passenger, Mr. Walter Green, has been returned to his original seat, where he should have been all along. We deeply appreciate his continued loyalty to our airline. A wave of murmurs rippled through the aircraft. Some passengers nodded quietly in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes down, guilt rising. But then the captain added something that made Marissa's knees go weak. "Miss Blake, please report to the galley immediately." The words echoed in her skull, each syllable hammering against her pride. She stood frozen. This wasn't a private reprimand. This was public. A broadcast to every passenger on board. Her face flushed with heat as she slowly turned and began the walk of shame toward the galley. No one was pretending not to watch anymore. Their curiosity was wide open now. Some faces tight with discomfort, others almost entertained. She passed rows of people who had once been under her command. Now they were witnesses, and she was the lesson. When she reached the galley, her breath was ragged. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She leaned against the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. This had once been her space, her stronghold, the place she could always reset, organize, take a moment to compose. Now it felt like a prison. The engine's soft hum filled the background, but nothing could drown out the suffocating pressure wrapping around her chest. Then, without warning, the in-flight phone rang. She flinched. Her fingers, trembling, reached for the receiver. She pressed it to her ear, forcing her voice into something that resembled control. "This is Miss Blake." But it wasn't the captain's voice that greeted her. It was someone far more powerful. "This is Russell DeWitt." Her entire body went cold. She had only heard the name in meetings, rarely spoken aloud. Russell DeWitt was the senior vice president of operations for the airline. He oversaw staffing decisions, compliance, and most critically, terminations. He was the man behind the curtain, and he was calling her directly. "We need to talk about how you handled Mr. Green." His voice was smooth and even, but beneath it was ice. "You removed a first-class passenger without verifying his identity. You humiliated him publicly. You caused a completely avoidable disruption." Marissa's throat constricted. I was following what I believed to be protocol," she said quickly. "There was a seating conflict, and I thought—" "You didn't think," he cut in sharply. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "You assumed. You acted without confirmation. That's not protocol. That's personal judgment, and poor judgment at that." She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Sir, This isn't a discussion," he said flatly. "When this flight lands, you will file a complete incident report. You will also appear before the executive board to explain your actions." She felt like the floor was tilting under her feet. "And one more thing," he added. A pause. She braced herself. "Effective immediately. Your employment status is under review." The words slammed into her like a collapsing wall. Her vision blurred for a moment. Her breathing became shallow. "Do you understand?" It took her a moment, but she managed to whisper, "Yes, sir." The line went dead. She lowered the receiver slowly. Her fingers were still gripping it tightly, as if letting go would make her collapse entirely. She wasn't in charge anymore. She hadn't been for the last hour. But now, officially, she was one step from being out. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. She stood in the galley, frozen in place. The metal counter beneath her palms felt cold, grounding. She leaned on it, trying to keep from sinking. For years, she had been the one giving orders, organizing boarding, calming irate passengers, taking pride in how she ran a smooth flight. She had owned the aisle. Now, she didn't even know where to stand. She could still feel the judgment lingering in the air from the captain's announcement. The entire plane had heard it. They all knew. There was no denying it now. No way to quietly pretend this was just a minor mistake. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure. A complete breakdown of judgment, compassion, and professionalism. And it had been broadcast seat to seat. She wasn't certain how long she stood there, breathing in the sterile scent of brewed coffee and airline wipes, the distant murmurs of passengers washing over her like waves she couldn't escape. But she knew one thing for sure. The woman who had walked onto this flight hours ago, confident, proud, untouchable, was gone. And whoever was left in her place was someone she barely recognized. Marissa Blake stood in the galley like a statue carved from tension and shame. She gripped the metal counter until her knuckles throbbed, her thoughts racing in desperate circles. Maybe if she found the right words, an explanation, an angle, something, she could salvage what was left of her career. Maybe this wasn't the end. But deep down, a darker truth sat heavy in her chest. There was no excuse. There was no spin that could untangle what she had done. And worst of all, the murmurs from the front of the cabin hadn't faded. She could feel them pressing into her, whispers laced with disapproval. Her world had flipped, and she knew she wasn't the one setting the rules anymore. For the first time in her years of flying, Marissa wasn't the one handing out consequences. She was the one receiving them. Soft footsteps broke the silence behind her. She turned slowly to see Alyssa, one of the newer attendants, a quiet but observant woman who had mostly kept to herself during training. Alyssa stopped a few feet away, her expression unreadable. They just called from corporate, didn't they? Her voice was gentle but clear. Marissa's jaw tightened. She didn't respond. Alyssa gave a small, slow exhale. They wouldn't have done that if it wasn't serious. Marissa snapped her eyes toward her, irritation rising like heat. I don't need your commentary right now. But Alyssa didn't flinch. She raised a hand slightly, not in defense, but in calm. I'm not trying to make it worse. Her words were simple, honest. But let's be real. You didn't actually check his ticket in the system, did you? The sentence hit like a slap. Marissa's fingers tightened against the edge of the counter. Mind your business, she muttered through clenched teeth, but Alyssa still didn't move. She tilted her head just slightly, studying her. Not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of disappointment. I watched the whole thing, she said softly. You questioned him, but no one else in that cabin. Just him. Marissa felt her stomach twist. She had told herself 100 times that she treated everyone the same, that she enforced the rules equally. But now, standing under the weight of everything that had happened, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. She hadn't asked questions when the others boarded first class. Only when Walter Green had taken his seat did she stop to doubt. Alyssa shook her head slowly. I've seen how you treat certain passengers, she said. But this time, you picked the wrong person. Marissa opened her mouth to defend herself, but nothing came out. Because deep down, she knew Alyssa was right. The silence between them lingered like smoke. Finally, Alyssa turned to leave. But before she disappeared behind the curtain, she said one last thing. You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say when we land. And just like that, she was gone, leaving Marissa standing alone with nothing but the roar of her thoughts. The minutes dragged by. But to her, they felt like hours. She remained at the counter, her grip so tight her fingertips ached. Her throat was dry. Her chest constricted with every breath. The reality of it all was closing in fast. Like water rushing into a sinking ship. She had always thought she was the one who held the plane together. That her firmness, her standards, her authority were the glue that kept chaos at bay. But now she wasn't even sure if she'd still be in uniform by the time they touched down in Oak Ridge. She tried to breathe deeper, to calm the swirl of panic that bloomed in her chest. Maybe, she told herself, maybe if I explain it clearly, if I show I've always done my job the right way, Someone will understand. But a colder voice, one that had been buried inside her for a long time, rose louder in her head. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. She had looked at Walter Green and made a snap judgment. She hadn't double-checked, hadn't asked, hadn't considered. She'd seen a man sitting where she didn't expect him to be, and assumed. She hadn't meant harm, but she hadn't acted fairly either. And now it was too late to take any of it back. A sharp knock on the galley wall startled her. She spun around, and there he was, the captain. His face was calm, but his eyes held a weight that made her heart seize. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're needed in first class," he said. Marissa blinked, trying to steady herself. For what? He paused, exhaled through his nose, and folded his arms. "Mr. Green has requested to speak with you." Her pulse skipped. For a brief second, she considered saying no, considered pretending she hadn't heard him. Maybe if she stayed back here, kept her head down, this whole thing could end quietly. But she knew better. There was no hiding from this. This wasn't something she could push on to another attendant, smooth over with a smile, or solve with a policy citation. She had created the damage, and now she would have to face it. There was no use pretending. Marissa Blake knew she had no way out of this. With her spine stiffened and her uniform smoothed over like a last defense, she stepped out of the galley and began the slow walk back to the front of the plane. It was only a few rows, but it felt like miles. Each step pressed down harder than the last. Her shoes tapped softly against the floor, but the weight in her chest echoed louder than any footfall. She could feel it. Passengers watching, some openly, others with sideways glances or still bodies and too quiet eyes. Some had seen the entire thing unfold. Others had caught only whispers. But every person on board knew something had happened. And now they were waiting to see how it ended. She reached his seat. Walter Green sat upright, poised, comfortable in a way that wasn't just physical, but personal. He looked like a man who had nothing left to prove. His back was straight. His hands rested calmly on the armrests. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaking with indignation or demanding anything. And that made it so much worse. Marissa cleared her throat. "Sir, you asked to see me?" Walter calmly closed the magazine he had been holding and looked up at her. His gaze was unwavering. "Yes," he said. "I have a question." She nodded slowly. "Of course." He leaned forward just slightly, folding his fingers together in his lap. "Why?" Her breath caught. I'm not sure what you mean." But she knew. She absolutely knew. His eyes narrowed, just a little. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in this seat?" The silence that followed was almost suffocating. From across the aisle and behind the curtain, a few heads shifted. Subtle movements. No one was speaking. But the entire plane was listening. Marissa opened her mouth, desperately searching for something to say. Anything that would make the weight of this moment lighter. She could say it was a mistake. That she'd misread the ticket. That she was distracted. But they both knew none of that would be true. She didn't answer fast enough. And then, surprisingly, Walter tilted his head and said gently, "You don't have to answer." Her mouth went dry. I already know," he said, cutting her off. Not cruelly, but with finality. His voice remained calm, firm, not loud. But the words hit with devastating weight. "I've seen it before. Too many times to count." She felt her face flush with shame. The heat of it rose from her neck to her ears, leaving her exposed under the soft cabin lighting. Walter continued, his voice steady. "I've been flying for decades. I've sat in more first-class seats than I care to remember. And still, someone always looks at me and assumes I'm in the wrong place." She swallowed hard, her lips pressed together, her hands clasped so tightly they trembled. "People like me," he added quietly, "still have to prove ourselves, even now." even here. The cabin was completely still. His words weren't shouted, but they roared. He took a long breath and shook his head, not in anger, but in understanding. "I don't need an apology," he said. She blinked, stunned. "You don't?" "No," he repeated, "because you already know. And so does everyone else on this plane." The finality of his words settled like a blanket over her chest, one that smothered, not comforted. In that moment, Marissa Blake realized she hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had lost something she might never get back. Respect. Without another word, Walter reopened his magazine. The conversation was over, because it never needed to be longer than that. Marissa turned stiffly. Each muscle in her body felt like it was working against her. Her legs were heavy. Her head hung lower than it had ever done before. She walked back down the aisle, trying not to look left or right. But the silence was worse than stares. People didn't speak, but their glances said enough. Some leaned away slightly. Others watched her with narrowed eyes before turning away as if her presence left a bitter taste. She reached the galley and braced herself against the counter. Breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Her body wanted to disappear. She wanted to step into a void and have this entire day erased. But she couldn't. She had been seen, not just by Walter, not just by Alyssa, not just by a few passengers, but by everyone. And now there was no hiding from it. The in-flight phone rang again. She didn't want to answer it. Her stomach twisted into a knot as she reached for it with a trembling hand. She pressed it to her ear. "This is Blake." The voice on the other end was not the captain. It was smoother, colder. "This is corporate security." She froze. The grip on the receiver tightened, her knuckles pale. "When this aircraft lands, you are to remain on board until a security team arrives to escort you." The words sank into her bones. "Do you understand?" She tried to respond, but her mouth felt like sandpaper. "Yes," she whispered. A pause. Then the voice continued. "You are not to interact with Mr. Green or any other passengers after landing. You will report directly to the executive office for immediate review. Any deviation from this instruction will result in instant termination." There was a click. Silence. The word termination rang in her ears. And this time, it didn't feel like a possibility. It felt like a certainty. She slowly placed the receiver back on the hook. Her fingers remained curled. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She looked up at the closed curtain separating her from the passengers, the same people she had once moved through with ease, issuing instructions, correcting behavior, enforcing order. Now she couldn't even stand among them. She wasn't one of them anymore, and she wasn't crew either. She was something in between, something forgotten, something done. The line had gone dead. Marissa Blake slowly lowered the receiver, but her hand wouldn't stop trembling. This wasn't just a formal warning. It wasn't a scolding from a superior or a note added to her personnel file. This was the edge of the cliff. She wasn't about to lose a flight. She was about to lose everything. Her job, her reputation, her identity. Everything she had built over 10 years, gone in the span of a single decision she couldn't take back. And now, she was the one being told where to sit, what to do, and who to report to. The irony sliced through her like a blade. A soft ding overhead cut through her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled. "We'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright position." The words were meant to be routine. But to Marissa, they hit like a sentence being read aloud in a courtroom. She gripped the counter in front of her like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Just hours ago, she had looked at passengers like Walter Green as if they didn't belong in the world she controlled, especially not in first class. Now, as the plane began its slow descent, she was the one who no longer belonged. And soon, she wouldn't be part of this crew, or this airline, at all. Further down the aisle, Walter Green sat quietly in his seat. He had felt the shift in the air over the last hour. The mood of the cabin had changed, the way passengers moved, the way they glanced sideways. Some looked at him with guilt, others with a kind of respect that hadn't been there earlier. He hadn't spoken much since returning to his seat. He didn't need to, because everyone else had already said everything through their silence. They had watched him be humiliated, and not a single one had spoken up. Now they were watching the fallout. Walter didn't want to make a scene. He never had. His power didn't come from yelling or confrontation. It came from presence. He had learned that a long time ago. When you carried yourself with quiet dignity, the truth would speak louder than any raised voice ever could. And the truth was doing all the work for him. He didn't need to ask for an apology. He didn't need to demand she be punished. She was already facing a much deeper punishment, one she'd carry longer than any formal review. The weight of knowing, of being seen, of being wrong. He reached down slowly and adjusted his seatbelt as the plane began to drop altitude. The familiar hum of descent filled the air, and the skyline of Oak Ridge began to emerge through the windows, bathed in golden sunset light. He glanced toward the front of the plane, not to look for Marissa, but to acknowledge the moment. She had thought she was above him. But when this plane landed, she'd walk off under the weight of shame. And he would walk off with his head held high. In the galley, Marissa clutched the counter tighter. The pressure in the cabin shifted as the plane dipped lower. Overhead, bins rattled softly. Passengers stirred, stretching their legs, tucking phones into seat pockets. Every second brought her closer to the landing. Closer to the moment she feared most. Her knees were unsteady. Her once pristine uniform felt like it was choking her now. Every thread a reminder of who she used to be before today. She had been through difficult flights before. She had handled complaints, arguments, even emergencies. But nothing had ever felt like this. Because this wasn't a delay. It wasn't an unruly traveler. This was her mistake. And it was unfixable. Down the aisle, Walter remained calm. His hands were still, resting atop his thighs. His posture was relaxed, but composed. This wasn't his first time encountering someone like Marissa. And sadly, he knew it wouldn't be the last. He had lived through decades of assumptions. He had grown up in a world where raising your voice only made people shut down faster. So, he learned to hold his tongue, to endure, to let his presence say what others refused to hear. But today had been different. Today, the person who wronged him wasn't walking away untouched. Justice, real, visible justice, was being served. And not by force, by truth, by the weight of her own decision catching up to her in front of everyone. As the plane dipped further, some passengers glanced his way again. A few offered sheepish smiles. Too little, too late. He didn't smile back, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about something bigger. How many others had been quietly removed, quietly dismissed, quietly judged, and never had a chance to speak? How many had walked off flights like this one, humiliated, with no one to bear witness? Today, someone had finally been held accountable, and she didn't even realize how lucky she was. Not because she still had a chance to explain herself, but because this time, someone had seen her clearly enough to stop her from doing it again. In the galley, Marissa's hands began to tremble harder. Her entire body was buzzing, not from adrenaline, but from dread. She could barely hear the passengers over the rushing in her ears. She wasn't the face of this flight anymore. She was the failure of it. The cautionary tale people would whisper about. The story passengers would share when they talked about the day someone finally got what they deserved. The descent felt like it was moving too quickly now, her breathing shallow, her thoughts loud. She had worked so hard for this career. She had given everything, holidays, birthdays, weekends, and now, all of it was about to be taken from her. Not because someone was out to get her, not because of bad luck, but because of one choice, one that exposed everything she had refused to examine about herself for years. The soft ding of the landing chime pulled Marissa Blake from her thoughts like a slap to the face. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came through the speakers, calm but final. "Welcome to Oak Ridge. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've arrived at the gate. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us." The words were standard, familiar, but to Marissa, they might as well have been a verdict. She turned her head slightly, peering through the narrow slit of the galley curtain. She could see the passengers beginning to stir, stretching legs, unbuckling belts, reaching overhead. But in the front row of first class, Walter Green didn't move. He didn't shift in his seat, didn't reach for his bag, didn't react at all. He simply waited. Still, steady, poised, as if he already knew how this story would end. Because he did. Marissa, on the other hand, was about to exit this flight in a way she had never imagined. A shadow moved across the galley wall. She flinched and turned, her pulse rising. It was the captain, standing quietly at the galley entrance. His hands were folded behind his back, his face unreadable. "They're waiting for you at the jet bridge," he said. Her mouth went dry. "Security?" He gave a slow nod. "And someone from corporate." Her stomach twisted into knots. She had suspected it, felt it coming like a storm she couldn't outrun. But hearing the words made it too real. This wasn't going to be handled with paperwork. This wasn't a routine misstep. It was serious. And now it was official. She wanted to say something, anything, to defend herself, to explain how all of this had spiraled out of control, that it had never been personal, that she had made an honest mistake. But one look at the captain told her he wasn't the one she needed to convince. He wasn't judging her, because he didn't have to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any justification ever could. He gave her one last look. "Please remain on board until all passengers have disembarked," he said. His voice was calm, professional, detached. And then he turned and walked away. The slow walk off the plane began. Row by row, passengers stood, collected their belongings, and made their way to the aisle. They moved in silence mostly, aside from the occasional stretch or click of a roller bag. Walter Green remained seated. He let every single person pass him. Some looked at him. Most didn't. But he didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't make a sound. He was patient. This moment belonged to him. And everyone knew it. Back in the galley, Marissa could barely breathe. She waited, heart pounding, as the last of the passengers exited. Each person walking down the aisle was one more witness to her downfall. She saw their expressions, some embarrassed, some curious, a few openly disapproving. The aisle was empty now, except for two people. Walter Green stood slowly, calmly. He reached down and lifted his bag with unshaken grace. His movements were deliberate, careful, dignified. And as he walked past her, down the long aisle toward the exit, Marissa stood frozen, eyes locked forward. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Because the message had already been delivered. She had treated him like he didn't belong. And now, she was the one left behind. A few seconds later, two security officers stepped onto the aircraft. Both wore dark suits, their expressions unreadable. One gave her a short, professional nod. "Ms. Blake, come with us." She inhaled sharply, her chest constricting. She didn't argue, didn't hesitate. Her legs felt like they were made of concrete as she stepped forward. Each movement was heavier than the last. She followed them through the same aisle she had walked hundreds of times before, giving instructions, managing expectations, maintaining order. Now she was walking it under escort. No passengers, no authority, no future. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the sterile gray walls felt smaller than usual, like they were closing in around her. Her fingers clenched at her sides. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She had walked this passage so many times. To board, to greet, to take command. But today, it felt like a walk toward the edge. The end of everything she had worked for. And the start of something far worse. Consequences. As she reached the terminal entrance, the first thing she saw was the two security officers waiting near the gate. But they weren't what made her blood run cold. It was the man standing beside them. Tall, poised, suit neatly pressed. Russell DeWitt, senior executive from the airline's operations team. The same man she had only ever seen in leadership emails and company-wide addresses. The man whose signature finalized promotions and terminations. He didn't speak as she approached, didn't offer a greeting. He simply looked at her with eyes that had already seen the footage, already read the complaint, already spoken with Walter Green's grandson, Jordan. He didn't need to hear her side, because there was nothing left to say. The terminal was buzzing with movement. Travelers shuffled past, wheeling suitcases, scanning boarding passes, calling out to companions. But Marissa Blake didn't see any of them. Her vision had narrowed to a single figure standing near Gate 11. A man in a sharply tailored Navy suit. Russell DeWitt, Senior Vice President of Operations. A name that could freeze conversation in a staff meeting and tighten the grip on any employee's ID badge. She had only seen him once, years ago, during a corporate seminar. He'd given a brief, polished speech about leadership, culture, and the responsibility of frontline excellence. Now he was here. And he wasn't smiling. She stopped just in front of him, her pulse hammering through her veins. "Ms. Blake," he said, his voice even, measured. She swallowed hard. "Sir." He exhaled through his nose and glanced at the two security officers beside him. Then he turned back to her. "You'll come with me." No explanation, no warning, because she already knew why. One of the officers gestured slightly, and Marissa followed without protest. The walk through the terminal was unbearable. This was her airport, her domain, the place where she had once moved with pride and authority, guiding passengers, enforcing rules, standing tall in her uniform. Now people stared. Some recognized her from the flight, others from the whispers now circulating at gates and baggage claims. She saw a few flight attendants she knew in passing. They looked at her, and then quickly looked away, as if eye contact might somehow make them part of her downfall. She clenched her jaw and stared straight ahead. She couldn't let them see her break. They entered a private hallway behind a secure access door. It led to the executive conference suite, a place she'd only ever heard about in rumors, where major decisions were made, where directors met in glass-walled rooms to shape the future of the airline. Flight attendants didn't go there, not unless something had gone horribly wrong. The door shut behind her with a soft but final click. The silence inside the room was deafening. It was cold, sleek, minimalist. A long glass table sat in the center, surrounded by tall executive chairs. Recessed lighting gave the space an eerie glow, bright enough to see every wrinkle in her uniform, every scuff on her shoes. Russell DeWitt moved to the head of the table and sat down. He gestured for her to take the seat across from him. She hesitated for a moment before obeying. Her legs felt brittle beneath her. As she sank into the leather chair, she pressed her palms into her thighs to keep them from trembling. Russell didn't speak at first. He tapped his fingers on the polished glass for a few seconds before locking eyes with her. "You've been with this airline for how long, Ms. Blake?" 10 years, she said softly. 10 years, he echoed. "That's a long time." She nodded stiffly, unsure where this was going, but knowing it couldn't end well. He leaned forward, his voice still calm but sharpened. "And in those 10 years, have you ever removed a first-class passenger without verifying their credentials?" Her heart thudded. She hesitated. Yes or no?" "No, sir." He nodded slowly, like he'd already known the answer. Then he leaned in just slightly. Then tell me, Ms. Blake, what made you so sure Mr. Green didn't belong in that seat? Her throat tightened like it was closing from the inside. She knew what he was asking, and she had no answer that wouldn't condemn her. I assumed there was an error, she said weakly. You assumed, he repeated, his voice like cold steel. She bit the inside of her cheek, eyes falling to the table. Russell leaned back, folding his hands. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? She nodded once, barely. But he wasn't finished. You didn't just remove a passenger, he said. You publicly humiliated a loyal VIP traveler, someone who's flown with us for years. You treated him differently without cause, and you did it in full view of an entire cabin. Her stomach turned. He reached into a folder and pulled out a printed sheet. He slid it across the table to her. She glanced at it. The name at the bottom made her breath catch. Jordan Green, Walter Green's grandson, and a name she hadn't recognized at the time, but now understood fully. He's one of our stakeholders, Russell said. A strategic partner. One of the people who ensure this company stays in the air. She blinked, her eyes burning. He filed this complaint directly to the executive board, before the plane even landed. Russell tapped the paper once. You know what that tells me? She didn't answer. It tells me that the moment you forced Mr. Green from his seat, his grandson already knew exactly how this would end for you. She sat motionless, staring at the complaint. Her breath stuttered. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Everything inside her was collapsing, and she couldn't find a single word to hold it together. Russell DeWitt didn't blink. He could have said 1,000 things, issued a final lecture, listed off policy violations, offered advice she was no longer in a position to hear. But instead, he kept it simple. He could have asked for anything, Russell said, his tone still calm, still controlled. Your immediate firing, a public apology, legal action. Marissa Blake couldn't bring herself to speak. Her throat was tight. Her pulse thumped loudly in her ears. Russell leaned back slightly, his eyes cold. But do you know what Mr. Green's grandson said? She shook her head, barely able to move. He said he didn't care what happens to you. The words landed like a punch. Russell didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because, he continued, the worst punishment you could receive is knowing why you lost everything. Silence, heavy and suffocating. She clenched her fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to cry, to scream, to rewind time. But it was too late. Russell let the moment stretch before closing the file in front of him with a quiet snap. The board will decide your termination status within 48 hours, he said. Until then, you are officially suspended without pay. Her heart plummeted. Please turn in your badge and employee ID before you leave this office. Marissa didn't move. She was frozen in the chair, breath shallow, vision blurry. She had walked into this airport a respected flight attendant, someone with experience, with control, with purpose. Now she sat across from one of the most powerful figures in the airline, being dismissed like she was nothing at all. Her fingers twitched slightly. Instinctively, they moved to her chest, where her badge had lived for the last 10 years. She'd pinned it on before every flight, straightened it in the mirror, smiled at her reflection, taken pride in what it represented. Now it felt like a scarlet letter. Her hand moved stiffly, and she unpinned it. The small metal clip snapped softly as it came free. She placed it on the table. Her hands trembled. Then she reached into her pocket for her employee ID. The card that had once opened every door now felt like a key to nowhere. She slid it across the glass surface. Russell DeWitt didn't touch either item. He just looked at her one last time and said, "You're free to go." The phrase stung more than she expected. Because she wasn't free. She was stripped. She rose to her feet slowly, her legs barely steady beneath her. As she pushed her chair back, it scraped against the floor with an awful screech that made her flinch. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Instead, she walked toward the door, every step echoing like a goodbye. She hesitated for a brief moment before placing her hand on the handle. She wanted to say something, to ask for a second chance, to plead for mercy. But mercy was something she had never given Walter Green, and now she wouldn't receive it in return. She stepped out of the office and the door clicked shut behind her. Soft, but final. The hallway that led back to the main terminal felt longer than it ever had before. The walls seemed to rise around her, the overhead lights unkind. Every footstep felt louder than it should have. Her hands clenched the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She just needed to get out, to reach the parking lot, her car, anywhere but here. But fate wasn't quite finished with her yet. As she stepped onto the main concourse, the golden light of the late afternoon spilled through the towering glass windows. And that's when she saw him. Walter Green, seated calmly near one of the window-side cafe tables, a cup of coffee in front of him. The sunlight touched his face with a soft warmth, outlining his features like a painting. He wasn't watching her. He didn't need to. He was simply there. And that was enough. She could have walked past him. She could have lowered her eyes, disappeared into the crowd, pretended she hadn't seen him. But something inside her, something she couldn't quite name, made her stop. She stood still, just a few steps away. And the distance between them felt like miles. She had only taken a few steps into the main concourse before she saw him. Walter Green, seated by the windows, framed by fading sunlight. He didn't look her way at first. He didn't need to. But Marissa Blake stopped walking anyway. The terminal around her faded into background noise. Travelers passed in blurs. Gate announcements echoed from distant speakers. Luggage wheels clattered against tile. But all she could hear was the sound of her own breath and the crushing silence between them. The distance was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon, one she had carved herself. Then, as if sensing her presence, Walter finally looked up. Their eyes met. No anger, no smugness, no sense of satisfaction. Just a calm, quiet understanding that struck deeper than rage ever could. And in that moment, her stomach twisted. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Walter didn't rise. He didn't lean forward. He simply studied her with the same quiet stillness that had marked him the entire flight. Then, finally, he spoke. Lose something? The question was simple. His tone even. Not mocking. But she felt it land like a blow. Her throat tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. And yet, she had no words to answer. She let out a shaky breath, tried again to speak. But there was nothing. Nothing that could make this better. Nothing that could rewrite the moment she had judged him without cause. That moment when she had looked at him, not his ticket, not the facts, and decided he didn't belong. Walter didn't press her, didn't scold, didn't gloat. Instead, he gave her the smallest of nods. Not of forgiveness, not of pity. Just acknowledgement. Then, without another word, he turned back to his coffee and stared out at the glowing skyline beyond the terminal window, as if she had already ceased to exist. And in that stillness, she realized the truth. He had moved on, and she was the one left behind. Outside, the air was cool. The automatic doors whooshed open as Marissa Blake stepped into the night. She walked across the pavement toward the parking lot, but her mind stayed behind, trapped in that plane, in that terminal, in that single irreversible choice. Her hand shook as she unlocked the car door. She slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in her world. Her fingers ached from how tightly she held it. For years, she had believed control meant power. That order meant respect. That following the rules, even when applied unfairly, justified her decisions. But now she understood something she never had before. power didn't come from authority. It came from dignity. And Walter Green had more of it in his silence than she had ever wielded in her uniform. She turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. But she didn't drive away. She just sat there, staring at the blinking airport lights through the windshield. Somewhere inside, Walter was probably boarding his connecting flight. Moving forward. Continuing on with his life. And she was stuck. Her eyes drifted to the rearview mirror, catching the terminal fading behind her. It looked the same as it always had. But it wasn't. It never would be again. Her mind reeled with the events of the last few hours. She had walked into that cabin with confidence, with control. She had adjusted her blazer, worn her badge with pride, run the first-class section like it belonged to her. But now she sat outside the very building where her entire identity had unraveled. Her grip tightened on the wheel. A part of her wanted to be angry, to scream that it wasn't fair, that she had only done what the rules demanded, that she had just been doing her job. But the voice in her head, the one she couldn't silence anymore, whispered the truth. It wasn't the job. It was you. She hadn't followed protocol. She hadn't checked the manifest properly. She had seen Walter Green in that seat and decided, without hesitation, that he didn't belong. She hadn't verified. She hadn't asked questions. She had just acted. And now she was paying a price she never saw coming. A shaky breath escaped her lips. Outside, flights were still arriving and departing. Luggage still circled the carousels. Airport shuttles blinked as they pulled to the curb. Life inside the terminal continued like nothing had happened. But for her world had stopped. She reached for her phone with numb fingers. The screen lit up. A new email notification stared back at her. Subject: Employee Status Update. Immediate suspension. Her stomach sank. She tapped it open, even though she already knew what it said. Her company access had been revoked. Her upcoming flights had been pulled from the roster. Her employee login no longer worked. She was officially benched. And the tone of the email, the cold, clipped professionalism, hit harder than she expected. She wasn't Marissa Blake, senior flight crew. She was just another terminated name on a list. She dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, stared out at the glow of the airport lights. She had always thought she was irreplaceable. She had believed her years of service made her immune to scrutiny. But now she knew. No one is immune to consequences, especially not when the damage done isn't just procedural, but personal. Another notification blinked on her phone, but Marissa Blake didn't move to read it. She sat in the driver's seat of her car, the interior dark except for the soft glow of the dashboard. Her hands rested limply in her lap, her phone forgotten beside her. She wasn't an employee anymore. Not really. Just another name in a system, flagged for investigation. Another case file in a corporate review. Another person whose mistake had been loud enough to erase a decade of service. Her hand trembled slightly as she locked the screen and dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. What was she supposed to do now? This job had been her everything. Her routine, her rhythm, her identity. The red-eye flights, the overnight layovers, the countless hours walking up and down aircraft aisles with a steady smile. It had all felt like a purpose. She had built her life around it. And now she didn't even know who she was without it. She blinked hard, trying to keep her breathing steady. This isn't the end, she told herself. There has to be something I can do. Some way to fix this. Maybe if she talked to corporate again. Maybe if she explained everything in person. If she apologized, owned up to it, showed them how much it all meant to her. Would that be enough? Could anything be? Her chest tightened with doubt, because the deeper truth was clawing its way to the surface. This wasn't just about a job. It was about who she had been while she had the job. How many passengers over the years had she brushed off? How many had walked off a plane feeling unseen, unwelcome, unworthy, because of her. She had always convinced herself she was fair, that she followed policy. But policy wasn't what made her question Walter Green's right to sit in first class. That hadn't been about regulations. That had been about her. Her assumptions, her bias, her failure to pause and see someone before judging them. And for the first time in her life, Marissa Blake understood what it meant to be powerless. And she hated it. A sharp knock on her window made her flinch violently. Her heart jumped to her throat. She turned, startled, to see a uniformed officer standing just outside her door. She hesitated, then slowly rolled down the window with unsteady fingers. The officer's face was neutral, unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, "we need you to vacate the premises. Employees who've been dismissed aren't permitted to remain on airport property." There was no judgment in his voice, just policy, the same kind of policy she had once used like a shield. She swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." The officer gave a polite nod and stepped back. She rolled the window up, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She wasn't even allowed to linger. They were treating her like a stranger now, like she didn't belong. And the most painful part? They were right. She reached for the gear shift, her hands stiff and cold. As the car slowly backed out of the space, she caught one last glimpse of the terminal in her rearview mirror. 10 years. 10 years of dedication. 10 years of flight checklists and boarding passes and pressed uniforms. Now it was just a place she wasn't welcome anymore. She pulled onto the road, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Her vision blurred. The road stretched out before her, empty and dark. Only the soft glow of streetlights and distant taillights gave shape to the night. She had driven this route hundreds of times, usually after long flights, tired but content, knowing she'd made it through another shift, another trip, another moment in control. But this drive was different. There was no exhaustion, no satisfaction, just a silence so thick it felt like it could suffocate her. She couldn't bring herself to turn on the radio. Even music felt too loud, too full of life for what she was feeling. Everything was quiet, except her thoughts. And they were deafening. Her mind drifted. Back to the flight, back to the aisle, back to Walter Green. She had expected him to be angry, to lash out, to demand answers. But he hadn't. Instead, he had looked at her with something worse, disappointment. And that look, steady, silent, knowing, was what echoed in her chest. She had always believed she was professional, polished, fair. But now, she had seen herself through his eyes, and she didn't like what she saw. She had made a decision about him before he had even spoken. She had assumed. And in doing so, she had revealed something about herself that she'd never had to confront before. How many times had she done it? Not just with Walter, but with others. How many people had she treated like they didn't belong? Like they weren't worthy of a smile or a second glance? How many had walked away with that same quiet humiliation she'd seen in his eyes? And how many of them never got justice? Never had a grandson with influence? Never had a phone camera recording? Never had the power to make their dignity known? A realization settled in her chest like a stone. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost the version of herself she thought she was. The person who believed she always did the right thing. The woman who was sure she followed the rules. But now she understood. She had become the problem. And now she was living the consequence. Just then, a sharp beep jolted her. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. A new message. Not from corporate. Not from a friend. From someone she hadn't heard from in a long time. She didn't open it yet. Because deep down, she knew. There was no message anyone could send that would change what had already been done. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a system alert. Not another cold auto email from HR. It was a message from her sister. Just saw something about you on social media. Call me. Marissa Blake's stomach twisted. Social media? Her fingers hovered over the screen, suddenly clumsy, trembling. She unlocked the phone, and the screen refreshed like it was waiting for her. Her name, front and center, trending, everywhere. News sites, video clips, headlines from tabloids and official outlets alike. And worst of all, passenger recordings. One headline stood out in bold letters. Flight attendant removes elderly black man from first class. Gets fired before landing. Her blood ran cold. She scrolled. The video was there. Clear, sharp, brutal. It showed everything. The moment she towered over Walter Green, questioning his presence, demanding he move. Her voice calm but laced with suspicion. His confusion. His restraint. Then the second video. Her walk of shame, returning to apologize. Escorting him back to his rightful seat, the look on her face, tight-lipped, red-cheeked, stiff with embarrassment, was frozen in time for the world to see and judge. Thousands of comments. She didn't even check his ticket, just assumed. Disgusting. Glad she got what was coming. Wonder how many people she's done this to. She got fired in real time. That's karma. Zero sympathy. She deserved it. Marissa's throat closed up. Her breath hitched as the comments scrolled faster than she could read. This wasn't just about the airline anymore. This was everywhere. She kept scrolling, her thumb shaking, her breathing shallow. More headlines, more analysis. Talk show clips. Viral tweets dissecting every second of the interaction. Some were even calling for her permanent ban from the airline industry. Others were digging up her personal information, her address, her old photos, even her family's social media profiles. She felt her vision blur, panic creeping up from her chest into her throat. This can't be happening. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat like it had burned her, then gripped the wheel again, tight, white-knuckled, trying to force oxygen into her lungs. This wasn't just a job loss. This was her life, unraveling in real time. The internet never forgets. And neither would anyone else. She gasped for breath, short and shallow, as the weight of it all closed in. Her name, her face, her mistake, blown across screens, comment sections, group chats. She was the villain in a story going viral. A cautionary tale. And the worst part? She couldn't even fight it. Because they were right. She had assumed. She had humiliated him. She had treated Walter Green differently. And now the world had seen it. She picked up her phone again with unsteady fingers, unlocking it like it might bite her. The notifications hadn't stopped. Messages from former co-workers, old classmates, people she hadn't heard from in years. Is it true? You're all over the news. What the hell happened? But one name stood out among them. A name she hadn't seen light up her screen in months. Mom. She hesitated, then tapped. The message was short. Just 4 words. What have you done? No judgment, no anger, just a quiet question. And somehow, it hurt more than anything else. Strangers online could mock her, insult her, even threaten her. She could handle that, almost. But knowing her family had seen it, knowing her mother was watching the fall unfold in real time, that broke something inside her. She let the phone fall to the seat again, tears stinging her eyes. She pressed the heel of her palm to her forehead, trying to push the weight of it all out. It didn't work. What was she supposed to do now? She had spent a decade building something, a career, a reputation, a version of herself she was proud of. And now, in the span of one flight, one moment, one choice, it was gone. She was nothing. No job, no career path, no future in the industry she had once called home. And worst of all, there was no way to hide. This wasn't just a mistake she could bury. This wasn't going to fade after a few news cycles. It was going to follow her, for months, maybe years, maybe forever. Because when the internet decides who you are, they don't let you change your costume. Her chest tightened again, this time worse than before. She knew what she had done. And now, so did everyone else. And no email, no phone call, no carefully worded apology was going to take it back. Because this wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a reflection of something deeper, something she had never questioned before today, something she now saw clearly and couldn't ignore. The road stretched out endlessly in front of her. Dark, still, quiet. Behind her, the soft glow of Oak Ridge International Airport slowly faded into the distance. To anyone else, it was just a building. To Marissa Blake, it had been a second home, a place that once symbolized pride, purpose, power. But now it was just a reminder of everything she'd lost in a single day. Somewhere back in that terminal, Walter Green was likely boarding his next flight. No fanfare, no speeches, no attention. He didn't need any of that. He had already won, in silence, with dignity. He was moving forward. And her? She was stuck. No destination, no direction, no idea who she was anymore. The world had seen it all. The moment of assumption. The fallout. The shame. It was out there, on screens, in headlines, in whispered conversations across dinner tables and office break rooms. Frozen in time. Forever. And no matter how far she drove, she couldn't outrun the weight of it. Her hands curled into fists on the steering wheel. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough already. She stared ahead at the open road, headlights cutting through the dark. But she couldn't see a future anymore. Not for the woman she had been. Because that woman, the confident, polished professional, was gone. Exposed. Unmade. And for the first time in her life, Marissa Blake finally understood something she had never really seen before. What it felt like to be the one who doesn't belong. What it felt like to be on the outside looking in. What it felt like to be left behind. Not because of injustice, but because of consequence. And the bitter truth that sometimes the worst punishment isn't losing a job. It's losing the person you believed yourself to be. And that's the story. A story about power. About silence. About the moments that define us. And the moments that unmake us. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories like this one. Sometimes the quietest endings speak the loudest truths.